Hello, everyone. I want to give you a quick update on where things are with superhero ethics. I'm coming back from my illnesses, and we will be coming back off of hiatus as of the beginning of December. We already have a new episode recorded for you, and I'm in the process of recording some more. We're going to do our best to keep honoring the strike. There's some other content that we were looking at. We also may start going to an every other week format for a little while, superhero ethics, just until the strike ends and with a lot of other things going on. But we will be bringing you new content soon. In the meantime, for the next couple weeks, we're going to bring back some greatest hits. Some episodes from the past. A lot of these are from a long time ago. Hopefully many of you subscribed since then, and so haven't heard these before. If you have, maybe just forgotten and want to hear them again. Or if not, scroll right along. Just stay subscribed. We'll have new content for you coming up quite soon. Please also remember that the best way to support everything we're doing is to join the membership program. $5 a month, or I think it's $55 a year. You get ad-free content. You get bonus content, not in these older episodes, but in the new episodes that are coming out, as well as a lot of the newer episodes I've recorded. And it's a great way to help support what we're trying to do here. There's a lot of work that goes into this. I'm trying to make sure I have enough time to do it. And, it costs money. It costs effort. And just that $5 a month can do so much to help us know that you care about the podcast, that you support it, you want to keep seeing more of it. Star Wars Universe Podcast will also be coming back. I'll have that announcement on an episode there. But for now, I hope you enjoy this older episode, and please stick around as a member. Please stick around as a subscriber, and we'll talk to you soon.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Superhero Ethics Podcast. I am Jacob Milicic. I am one of your hosts. Joining me, as always, is Matthew Westfox, another of our hosts. Matthew, how are you doing?
Not too bad, not too bad. I just got engaged this week, so I've had a very active week, and I get to have a podcast this week where I will say very little, so it's kind of perfect.
Yeah, that's going to be a rare thing. One of these times we'll have a podcast where I don't talk very much, maybe, ever. But today we've got two very special guests on. I'm very excited to have this conversation because they're really the reason why I decided to talk about this sort of thing at all. And it's it may seem a little bit of a departure from what we normally talk about, because normally we're talking about superhero stories like things out of comic books, things out of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, talking about Tony Stark, very occasionally talking about Daredevil and Kingpin, right, from the Netflix MCUs that nobody ever watches or talks about. But today, we're going to talk about wrestling, specifically this creature called professional wrestling, which includes things like the WWE, but also other promotions as well, other forms of this. And first, I'm going to introduce our guests so people will know who's who when the voices come up. And then we're going to talk a little bit about why this is, so that people who are like, why in the world is this superhero podcast talking about wrestling? So first off, I'd like to introduce Tim Aubel, good friend of mine. Tim, how's it going?
Going pretty well, thank you.
So Tim, you're sort of among my local friends group, our local friends group, right? You're kind of the, as we've been saying, the patient zero here, the one who infected everyone else with this passion. What got you started watching wrestling, getting into wrestling?
So there was one Friday or Saturday night where I was channel surfing and trying to figure out what was on TV, and I came across a television show where there were people in this wrestling ring. One of them was holding a microphone, had his foot on another man's neck on top of a briefcase, and was yelling, "Bring them back or I'm going to break this man's neck."
Okay.
And I immediately went, okay, this is very clearly pro wrestling and fake, but one of my great loves in fiction is world building and storylines and settings, and I wanted to know how they got to this point and what came to this point and what everyone was talking about. So from that point, I sort of dove in looking for internet places where they would talk about this and sort of just learn everything in this weird, wild world of people yelling that they're going to break a man's neck just in the middle of a crowded arena.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. So Addison, how about you? Where do you come from in this? What's your perspective and history with wrestling?
So I've always had a massive spot in my heart for things that are incredibly over the top. A little bit of that comes from some small background in theater, I think, but that means comic books, action movies, anything where just the amount of melodrama and emotion on display is far outside the bounds of what a normal person would expect to experience. And so Tim found out about that and said, you should definitely watch wrestling. And invited me and a couple other friends over, and the rest is history.
That sounds accurate on all accounts. So from my perspective, I think I'm the latest bloomer within this particular group, the one who got into it last. But I sort of bit hard onto this, and so for our listeners, why we're talking about wrestling specifically is that while when you're looking at it from the outside, it looks a lot like a soap opera. It has a lot of the same kind of tropes and trappings of soap opera. It's also very much like comic book superhero stories with clear heroes, clear villains, storylines surrounding them. You've got plots and schemes. You've got people with agendas, and you've got people who are supposed to be presenting as the right side of things. They're the good guys. They're doing good guy things. And then you've got people who are being underhanded or sneaky or doing stuff that shouldn't be allowed and are getting away with it. And so obviously they're your villains. And as it turns out, both within the fiction of wrestling itself, but also surrounding the business and surrounding the culture and the fans, there are a lot of ethical considerations to dive into. And so as I've been getting more into it, Matthew and I had been talking and thinking, is this a topic? And we think it is. So from that perspective, what are your thoughts on...
do I get to chime in with my history with wrestling?
Yeah, what's your history with wrestling, Matthew?
Well, and it's kind of a joke because mine is probably I have the least connection to wrestling here, and I'm going to sort of be the new person voice, the voice of the everyman here who doesn't have any idea what you guys are talking about. But I have an odd story with it because I actually probably I was watching wrestling a long time ago when I was a kid, back when, at least among the people who I knew who were into wrestling, and this is the days of the 80s when it was Hulk Hogan and Superfly Snuka and the Iron Sheik and 8 million other horribly racist tropes of the sort. They weren't being honest about that, or they don't really being honest, but they were not being quite so clear about the fact that it was obviously fake. And I remember knowing a lot of people who thought it was real and thought it was a real competition on the same level as the NFL or Major League Baseball. And I liked it when I was 10, and then I got to be a little bit older, and I realized it was kind of silly, and I lost my taste for it. And I think a big part of what intrigued me when I came back to it a lot later, mostly because you guys were so into it, is the fact that now it is completely understood that this is fake, but when I say fake, I should say it's fictionalized, that there isn't an actual competition happening where people are unsure who is going to win in the wrestling match, that these are all scripted, but as a couple of you pointed out, that it's a soap opera playing out. And I'll say, while I've watched maybe 3 wrestling events over the last 20 years, namely a couple of Royal Rumbles or WrestleManias with you guys, between the conversations you all have been having, and also I have to be honest, watching the TV show Glow, which really did a great job of exploring the behind-the-scenes discussions about the heels and the faces and how you write these stories and how you find the ethical storylines, it really got me excited, and I'll probably be taking more of a back seat than anyone else in this topic, but hopefully asking some questions because it's one I'm really excited for us to talk about. And just by knowing a couple of our other friends who are bummed that they can't be on this podcast, I'm sure this is a topic we're going to be returning to more than once. So I'm looking forward to this.
Glow is a great example, too, as someone who has watched that show. It does a very good job of showing the fiction of the storylines, but also the reality of things like injuries and racial tensions and all those sorts of things.
Right, and I think it almost goes without saying if you know anything about Glow, but obviously the gender dynamic and how it played out 20, 30 years ago is different than how it's playing out now, and it continues to evolve. I'm not sure it's in the best place that it can be right now, but I guess hope springs eternal is sort of my catchphrase.
I mean, Eric Aleph, who is one of the friends who I know, a fellow judge who really wanted to be on this podcast, he was pointing out to me that we at least are no longer in the days of the bra and panty matches. So we've made progress.
Oh, yeah, I have not gone back to watch those. I did not start at that point. I have no desire to go back to it.
So, sort of as we said, we're entering into this with the understanding that at least the stories we're being told sort of in media, right, are fictional. But there's still, and I want to make sure this is understood, the athleticism it takes to do the things that these people do is just incredible. And so it's interesting that we have this sort of performative art form that is so physically taxing and can often still be very dangerous, that is not ostensibly actually competitive, at least for what people see in ring, what people see that's like televised or in local house shows. We'll get more into that, I think, when we're talking about the reality, like the meta concerns. But for right now, I think the first thing to talk about, which is the thing that's the closest parallel to superhero stories, are what takes place like within the fiction itself. And this sort of with the understanding that sometimes it's harder to separate problems we're having with the fiction with problems we have with the people who write the fiction, who are technically outside of the fiction and blah, 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 blah. But we deal with that with everything else that we talk about on here, I think. So this is not all that different. And so I guess I'll throw to Addison this time. What's something that you think about when you think about ethical considerations within the fictional stories of wrestling?
So the big thing with talking about the storylines of wrestling is, as Matthew was saying, it goes back to the historical big tropes that all of the wrestling has to rely on in order to tell the kinds of stories that it wants to tell with no information other than this guy's punching this guy in the face. And you're supposed to root for this one even though he's doing the punching right now. And so when I am thinking about the ethical considerations of wrestling storylines, the things that jump to mind for me are typically the big things that move storylines between the matches, the promos that wrestlers use to threaten other wrestlers or threaten the audience or build themselves up, and the content of those promos tends to be the most fraught place for those tropes turning into stereotypes or worse, which is never great. A recent example of this was when Jinder Mahal was the WWE champion a couple of years ago. He had a big challenger in Shinsuke Nakamura, who is a Japanese wrestler, and Jinder Mahal had several promos over the course of one night that were making fun of Shinsuke's slanty eyes and things, which is didn't go over well with the live audience, didn't go over well with the internet audience, and that particular angle was not broached again over the course of that storyline. But it was very troublesome to hear at the time.
Absolutely. Goodness. That's unfortunately not all that surprising to hear, because one of the things that is always jarring to me is that it seems like there's this idea that as soon as they've identified somebody as a bad guy, sometimes that seems to indicate to them, oh, this person's a heel, so we can have them say whatever problematic garbage we want, and it's okay because they're supposed to be the bad guy. Do you guys get that same feeling that that's like part of the conceit?
There's definitely a line there. Acceptability of insults is the term that I really want to use there. There are definitely places where heels, the bad guys in this case, will go that would be crossing a line if you're just talking to your friends or giving a speech in front of a crowd at a press conference or a political rally or something like that. Like, the line is much further in that case, but there are still lines that you don't want to cross because everybody knows that it's fictional. This wasn't exactly a promo, but there was a match a few months ago where there was a double amputee wrestler. He had 2 amputated legs, and one of the other wrestlers in the ring at the time repeatedly called him Lieutenant Dan during the match.
Oof.
And trying to get heat, trying to get the crowd to boo him, but like, there are still lines that make people uncomfortable even if they're supposed to be booing.
That concept of heat is something that's, I think, important to bring up here, especially for the listeners who aren't super into wrestling. Heat is when the audience is reacting to what you're doing in any way. And there's positive heat from being very good and wanting people to root for you, and there's negative heat for being very evil and having people boo you. And it's fairly common to try to get that heat cheaply by making fun of the local sports team or making fun of your opponent in some way that is, like this, not an acceptable target in the modern culture.
Right. Like the making fun of Shinsuke Nakamura's slanty eyes, right? Like, I think that the intent was to try to get some cheap heat for Jinder Mahal, but just because it's wrong, because it's wrong for somebody to say, yeah, you're probably going to get a big reaction, but that doesn't mean that it. I guess the cost isn't always worth it, right?
Right.
In a lot of ways, what they end up doing is pervading some of these toxic or problematic ideas in our culture that these things are ever acceptable to say, like in jest, for example.
Right. And it's interesting because I think that's a problem that comes up in a lot of other spaces. A long time ago on this podcast, we did an episode actually on the ethics of live-action role-playing. And there was a time where one of the most problematic things that would happen in that kind of live-action role-playing, which for those who don't know, it's more where it's like a role-playing game, like Dungeons & Dragons, but it's much more of like there's much larger groups of people and everyone is standing up and wearing costumes. Although this could be a problem even in just, 5 people playing D&D around a table, where someone would have the attitude of, oh, well, my character is this terrible racist, and so I'm saying terrible racist things in my character. And in that world, at least, it seems there's been there's still a lot, that attitude is still pervasive, but there's been a big move, especially from the game publishers, to really say that's not okay at all. It sounds like within the WWE world that there's somewhat of a move away from it, but that still a lot of it exists. Is that you think fairly accurate?
That's absolutely accurate. The WWE has made great strides in some directions, and in many other directions, such as the treatment of wrestlers of color, made few strides forward, and in more specific ways, steps backwards.
There's a wrestling trope, a classic wrestling trope, which is the foreign heel, which tends to devolve from, instead of a character being a heel and being a bad guy for the things they're doing, turning them into being a bad guy because they're not from America, or in the case of a Japanese promotion, because they're not from Japan. And it's popular, but it's very easy to do and really sort of cheapens the effect of the bad things those characters are doing.
Right. like for a long time, Rusev's shtick is still that he's foreign, right? But he was being billed from Russia because we were having issues with Russia, I think, is the history. I'm not 100% on that because I wasn't into the product back when that was happening. Before we get too much further, I just want to make sure people understand. So we're going to use some terminology like heel, like face. For anybody not in the know, like that literally translates to heel, villain, face, hero. You can sort of internalize those ideas that way. The face is sort of a shorthand for baby face. Heel is a lot, I think, more of a straight line for villain, but like heels are people who are you're supposed to boo, and faces are people you're supposed to cheer. And the reason why I wanted to sort of transition into talking about that is that there are some times where we're given a character that we're supposed to boo, and here's where we sort of get like it seems almost a peek behind the curtain, where what they're writing instead people are like, yeah, that makes sense, they're right. Such as the main example I'm thinking of is Daniel Bryan, who I love, who is a vegan, right? Like real life is a vegan, has and also eco-conscious, and they sort of had him adopt that as his heel gimmick, yelling at people for buying concession stand hot dogs and stuff like that, and it felt to me for the promotional material I've seen, like the intent was that people were supposed to be mad at Daniel Bryan, be like, no, don't take away, I'm American, I'm whatever. And actually I've seen a lot of reaction that's more like, yeah, he's not wrong. We don't hate him. That was
actually one of the things I was going to ask, is because I know I know that often on this podcast, Jacob, you and I, the villains who you and I are almost most drawn to are the folks like Magneto or Killmonger or some guy in Daredevil who wears a white suit whose name I can't remember. But we often talk about how it's the villains who we think have a point as opposed to the mustache twirlers. The way you're describing it, it sounds like most WWE villains are written much more mustache twirly, but that there are some that are much more like they have a point of view that someone could agree with.
I mean, again, I'm still pretty new to it. I've seen far more of the sort of one note, like this is this person's gimmick type characters. There are some that are more nuanced or that have more. In this particular case, just something where there's like a nugget of truth behind what they're saying that's not necessarily completely villainous or wrong thinking, right? As opposed to some of the I'm trying to think of an example of a heel who's clearly just doing something bad that is not like problematic, but is definitely like something no one's going to agree with. And for whatever reason, I guess Samoa Joe is a good example, right? Because he likes to ambush people before they actually have matches and not actually fight the real matches.
Samoa Joe also likes to threaten people's families.
Yeah, sure, and that's obviously a problem. But this is something we see comic book villains do as well, right? Like when somebody is like, "Oh, I have found your weakness. You care about this person, so I'm going to threaten them to get to you." Same kind of thing here, right? And sometimes it plays well, and sometimes it doesn't. So anyway, not to get too digressive on this, because there's a lot more to talk about in terms of the fiction. But anything else on just sort of what these people what is acceptable for people to say, and the problems that we have when these characters are being portrayed in this way or saying these types of things in order to get that negative reaction from the crowd?
Well, sometimes even with sensitive topics, they're handled well. I remember one storyline a couple years ago between two women wrestlers, Nia Jax and Alexa Bliss, who started out as friends, and then quote-unquote secretly, Alexa was recorded in backstage segments insulting Nia and body-shaming her because she's she used to be a plus size model and that sort of thing. Just a lot of bullying segments, which went on for a while and culminated in Nia beating Alexa for the women's championship at WrestleMania, the biggest show of the year. And that's a topic that there's a lot of sensitivity and people are very sensitive about. But in this case, both of the performers have personal history with things like eating disorders or that sort of bullying and body shaming, and wanted to tell this storyline in this way to bring attention to that. And I felt it was handled very well.
Well, and that actually is a really good point that I was thinking about before when you were bringing up things like the anti-Asian comments or the Lieutenant Dan comments, which is, I think, as you said, the fact that both actors in it are on board with it and are okay with it doesn't make it okay necessarily, but I do think is a very important point. Because I was wondering in that sort of, to me, I would feel very differently about something like the Lieutenant Dan thing if I knew that the person who was playing the heel went up to that disabled wrestler backstage and said, hey, how do you feel about if, like, during the promos, I use these, I call you Lieutenant Dan, or things like that. And do you guys have an idea how often does that happen? Like, do they make sure that the face is on board with the way that they're going to get bullied and commented, or is it often just as much a surprise to them on screen as it is to the audience?
Boy, it is really tough to know that sometimes. I'm not privy to all that backstage information, but they do review scripts, they do review that sort of thing, they review their matches together beforehand with each other. So I assume to some extent it's discussed, but I'm not sure how much. There are some things that some performers will refuse to say. There was a recent segment with then Dean Ambrose, who was a heel, where he was given a script of what he was supposed to say about on hiatus Roman Reigns, who was on hiatus due to a real-life leukemia diagnosis. And Dean absolutely refused to say a particular line that was in the script because he was quoted as saying, "It will lose us sponsors if I say this."
Right.
So there are definitely instances of ensuring there's consent from all performers for certain things, but not necessarily all the time.
Right.
And if there is going to be any kind of informed consent with regard to anything in a wrestling match, the words are probably the thing that's going to slip your mind the most, considering the amount of improvisation and working from bullet points that most promos tend to be composed of.
And I'd imagine that there's a direct correlation between how popular of a character you are with the fans and the amount of power you have to push back like that. And that there's probably... It's great when characters can say, no, I don't want to do that, but that if you're, a new character who's getting their first big break, you probably have less, comfort speaking up like that.
Absolutely.
That makes sense to me. Obviously, I'm not an insider. I don't know how it works, but from some interviews that I've listened to, that does seem to be the case, right? Where, like, people who are just breaking in the industry have a lot less agency over, being able to draw those lines than people who are more established and can use their star power, right? And this is also an ethical topic, right? People who use their star power to influence what is promoted, right? What ends up in the final product. And
I mean, for a while, there were a lot of wrestlers who had creative control written into their contracts so they could do that sort of thing. It's definitely something that's been an issue historically.
Yep. Absolutely. And so, like, this plays directly into us talking about ethical things in the fiction, because when you get right down to it, the stories we get told are told through a combination of the physical action taken by the wrestlers involved in the stories and by the words they say. And Addison, I think it was you who had said that they get, like, bullet points and then talk from there. Or was it Tim? I'm sorry, I don't actually remember who said it. the if there is some degree of improvisation, right, that means that some amount of ownership of those words does go to the talent.
Mm-hmm. And the degree of bullet pointing, from what I've also gleaned from interviews, because I'm also not a backstage insider, is that it varies not only promotion to promotion, but also wrestler to wrestler. Some people are either due to their star power or just due to having proven that they're good at improv, are given more or less fleshed out scripts to work from, and people who are not proven to be able to work a microphone are given a full word-for-word promo that they're expected to memorize.
Right. And I mean, from a just a structure perspective, that makes sense, right? You don't want your show for the evening to go off the rails because somebody who's less comfortable with improvisation, misses a line or misses the train of thought or loses themselves, or is doing something the audience isn't buying into. But it does mean that those people inherently have less agency over what they end up saying, right? So anyway, moving on to another, it wouldn't be me, I think, on a podcast like this if I didn't at least briefly touch on the fact that basically every conflict that any of the heroes and villains have with each other in wrestling is solved via some form of violence. Sometimes very extreme violence, other times less extreme violence, but it's still a fight, right? The idea in the fiction is that these two people are fighting each other until usually either one person lays down on top of the other person long enough, or makes the other person go, well, if I don't do this, I'm going to lose one of my limbs or my lower back or something. In talking about submissions. And I've spoken on this podcast in the past about how, I'm not always super a fan of all conflicts being resolved via violence, and yet I really enjoy this. And for me, at least, I draw a lot of parallels with wrestling in Hong Kong action theater. Movies like Hero, or like The One, or I'm just listing off Jet Li movies, apparently Fearless, but also like Kung Fu Hustle. These movies that are the parallels for me are the physicality of the people involved is part of the story, right? And so like because of that, the violence is almost inherent in, like, I don't think you can tell wrestling stories without violence, and that inherently feels like a problem to me, but it's also something that I enjoy, which is something I wrestle with. Does anybody else feel that way? Does anybody else feel like a little bit guilty for enjoying this because it's being sort of promoted to you as violence, fictional though it may be?
Yeah, and I wonder how much of my enjoyment of that is due to my brain going and knowing that it's fake. Like, I don't watch UFC or MMA or boxing or the real sports where it's solved through punching each other in the face really hard. I tend to look at this a lot like the stunt shows at something like Disney World or Universal Studios, where there's these incredible feats of athleticism, and there is also a storyline, and just like there's a lot of violence inherent in that sort of thing. And I think my brain ties those two things together more than I realized when I started watching it.
That makes a lot of sense.
I definitely agree that I would not watch wrestling if it was real. What it comes back for me is, as I mentioned at the very top of this, it's so melodramatic and over the top, and they use the violence to serve sometimes a greater story and sometimes a lesser one. But it's not violence for the sake of violence. It's violence for a righteous cause or violence for revenge or something like that. And having a full actual story before and after the match where that violence has consequences and was a consequence of things is an important distinction between wrestling and actual sports.
Yeah, absolutely. Because unlike with actual sports, where it's only the outcome, it's only the winner and loser that matters, and that's it. There's implications after the fact. In particular, a story that culminated at this year's WrestleMania with Kofi Kingston, where it was basically a story about somebody who's been working really hard, working in the industry a long time, not being given opportunities, right? Very classic sort of blue-collar hero type story structure. But the opportunities we're talking about are specifically, these in-ring physical competitions. And a lot of the storytelling around there was very violent, up to and including him having to fight like multiple people in sequence on a given night, right? But the outcomes of that were always more important. It was about proving that people saying that he wasn't good enough or that he didn't deserve those opportunities and that's why he wasn't being given them were wrong. And that was the real, right? That was the story. It wasn't that, oh, he's super strong and so he's going to punch everybody to prove that he's the strongest. It was he's good at this. And it wasn't just about raw strength, but it was about talent.
Yeah, the story, the violence is a storyline beat as opposed to being the whole storyline.
Right. And especially since some spots look impressive as heck, and actually, when you think about how much it would hurt, probably not a lot. Some, but probably not all that much, unless you do it wrong. Which, there's some shooting star presses I have seen that make me go, oh, that move's way more dangerous than I thought. But only to the person doing it. So
I don't think that I've ever had my eyes open for the entirety of a Jeff Hardy Swanton Bomb.
Because it's so risky. And that's the other thing. Like, so we can, that's actually a really good launch off point to talk about, unless people had more to talk about in the fiction. We could jump right into talking about sort of more of the real life concerns, because these are people, obviously, who are doing these as I think most of us have intimated, incredibly impressive and sometimes very dangerous athletic feats for our entertainment. You can draw some parallels to football, though the analog's not quite the same because American football is still an actual sports competition. But I sort of mentally go even farther back and think historically back to the Roman Colosseum, right? And the violence sport for the entertainment of others, people putting their bodies at risk. It's not the same because people aren't literally trying to kill each other as far as I know. So better, right? But still a lot of concern there.
Yeah, I mean, football or any sport is really a good example because to some extent you can't always fully enjoy it knowing how much risk they're putting their bodies under and how horrible injuries can be to witness and how devastating they can be to someone's life in some cases. I have watched much less football recently as athletes are getting more and more physically impressive. It means the injuries are more and more physically devastating due to speed and power and all those sorts of things. And it's really tough to watch knowing that you might see something horrible, which is a problem in wrestling too. There are definitely spots and moves where I have to swallow hard afterwards and I'm holding my breath to make sure that it goes off without a hitch and that there's no devastating injury.
Well, in regard to the NFL, Tim, I think you make a really good point. And I know that in recent years, we've been talking a lot in football, not just about the sort of momentary, oh my God, that hit destroyed that person's leg, they're never going to walk again, which, as you're right, are awful. but also just the growing understanding that the years of repetitive injuries, especially repetitive head injuries and concussions, we discover 10, 15, 20 years later have massive brain damage effects that are causing, horrific life-altering effects, including a number of suicides and other just really debilitative issues. And that further, in the NFL, there has been a real pushback from the NFL against changing the safety rules to prevent those kind of things. And that's now getting better, but it took a while. Has there been anything like that in wrestling? Like, have we been hearing stories about wrestlers from the 80s and 90s who are now suffering, traumatic brain injury or I think that may not be the right technical term, but
concussion
from repeated...
or what is it called? CED, or there's a CTE,
right.
Yeah.
But do we have stories from wrestlers who are dealing with that 10, 15 years after they retired? And has the WWE... I just as one example off the top of my head, I'm guessing it would be much harder to pull off the storylines if all the wrestlers were in helmets. But I don't know if anyone's ever pushed for that. Like, what have those discussions that have happened in the NFL been playing out in professional wrestling?
Yeah, and so unfortunately, there aren't really stories about wrestlers suffering long-term effects from concussions 15 years after they retired, because most wrestlers don't live 15 years after they've retired due to their repetitive head injuries.
It's the lifespan of a professional wrestler it's unreal and really sobering when you realize. I'm sorry. Continue, Addison.
The conversation around things like concussions and the more dangerous spots has absolutely evolved over the last 20 years or so. If you look back even to the early 2000s, you see the WWE, which is, from at least in America, easily the most conservative of the promotions as far as violence now, which is not a high bar to clear. They would have spots with unprotected chair shots to the head, and they had more matches with thumbtacks and things, and just even the things that aren't especially dangerous but look impressive because they make you bleed from the forehead. They've been cutting back on doing that and making it look more bloodless over the last half a decade or so. And even in the WWE, it's still there's still lots of instances where things just don't work, and it causes a problem. The most recent example that I can think of off the top of my head is the storyline leading up to WrestleMania this year, where Becky Lynch, who is currently the women's champion, took a bad hit to the face and ended up with a broken nose and a mild concussion from essentially a light punch that was just set up a little bit wrong, but heads are fragile. And
so I have to ask at this point, and it sounds like maybe you partially answered this question by saying that things have gotten better. What you just said about how we don't really know because most of the wrestlers from a while that wrestling distinctly shortens people's lifespan. If that was true today, I think I would have trouble. I get my question was going to be how do you justify watching it then if it is actually that horrific health responses? It does sound like from what you're saying it has gotten better. Is that am I understanding there?
Yeah, like the wrestlers who are retiring today, like Kurt Angle, who recently retired, are considerably more likely to not become statistics in the next 5 years. than wrestlers who retired 10 or 15 years ago.
Right. We also have, I'd be remiss to not mention this, there's more talk about it in the wrestling fandom and professional wrestling community in general now. In particular, there's a very famous wrestler from a while ago now, Rob Van Dam, RVD, who released a documentary called Headstrong. It was originally supposed to be a documentary about something else entirely, where he was going around doing some stand-up comedy, I want to say, but he was suffering some long-term CTE effects, didn't realize it, was trying to just power through it, and the documentary ends up being about him seeing doctors, getting the diagnosis, going through all of that, being told like his things like his life expectancy and what's going to happen with his brain, his thought, and his thinking and stuff over time is just fantastic thing to have come out. Really, really really heartbreaking that it had to happen like in a way where you can see it, but at least there's visibility, right? And thankfully there's some light at the end of the tunnel. There's some medical research into the effects of the possible use of CBD oil to help actually recuperate damaged brain tissue, which they didn't realize could be done before. So there's potentially a light at the end of this, but the most important thing about this is that the community is talking about it, is aware of it, up to and including there was a spot on what's John Oliver's show called? Last Week Tonight? Yes, Last Week Tonight with John Oliver, where he basically calls out the WWE on the health concerns for its talent, right? It was talked about a lot then, and there's obviously some people in the business who didn't have the best reaction to it, but it is being discussed more now than it was back then, where first of all our understanding about things like concussions was poorer, but also, you know, a lot of that stuff would get swept under because that wasn't good for the brand, right? That sucks. I don't like thinking about something like that, but that's probably the reality of the situation, right?
Well, there was a lot in the old days. There was a lot of suck it up and keep wrestling so you didn't lose your spot. And these days, wrestlers are more informed and companies are more informed, and there's a lot more focus on safety and making sure that everyone is recovered and good to go before they keep putting that repetitive strain on their bodies. Like, obviously, it's wrestling, it's high impact, it's going to have some damage regardless, but there's been a big push to make sure people are healthier before putting them back in, as opposed to telling them to suck it up, take a bunch of painkillers, and go out and do it again tomorrow, which leads to huge issues down the road.
Absolutely. Right. And none of this actually answers your question, right? How can we keep watching this knowing that this stuff is happening is a completely fair question, and it's something that I, certainly intended, wrestle with. It's tough. But I guess, these people, so I guess my stance on it is that the people who are engaged in this, they want to do this, right? This is, and so what we can do as fans, I think, is make sure that we're supporting the promotions and the endeavors that actually are taking care of their talent and champion for sane, right? Like, better health care for these people, making sure that's part of their contracts, their deals, making sure that we are treating things like concussions very seriously and doing what we can to prevent them from happening. These are things that I, as a fan, can support by supporting promotions that are doing something about that, and by challenging promotions that clearly are doing things that look unsafe. That being said, I'm still consuming AEW, and they definitely did an unprotected chair shot to the head earlier this year, and that's already given me some consternation.
And they've said, yeah, that was a mistake since then. Which I give them props for there. They didn't have to say, yeah, that was a mistake, we're not going to do it again, but they did.
Well, and when we're talking about the problematic storylines and kind of moving us away from the violence question a little bit, we talked a lot about the issues around wrestlers of color and stuff like that. I'm wondering if you all can talk somewhat about gender, because I know one of the times when it seems like every about 5 or 10 years I kind of poke my head into wrestling to see what's going on. And one of the last times I did before talking to you all in the last couple of years was back around 2000, 2001, when a lot of my friends at that time were talking about it. And I remember watching some of the women's matches, and it was basically softcore pornography. And my understanding is that has gotten a lot better. And I know, Tim, you have talked about that being a lot better. Can you guys talk to someone about that? I mean, and granted, as 4 guys, we're maybe not the best experts to talk about this, but I still think it's worth noting how is gender treated in this, in what, at least traditionally, has been it seems like there has been a huge amount of sexism in how women wrestlers were treated.
That's a big topic. But to start with, several years ago, the WWE Women's Division was called the Divas Division, and the championship belt was a purple sparkly butterfly. Which, obviously has some problems. But since then, very soon after I started watching, and one of the things that kept me watching was there was a WrestleMania where they announced that the Divas Division was being renamed to the Women's Division, and that the women would no longer be called divas, they were just going to be superstars, just like the men. They got a championship belt that was a recolor of the men's championship belt, and they're being treated like legitimate athletes and legitimate competitors, unlike when they were doing basically softcore pornography and being eye candy for the 25 to 34-year-old men watching.
And I can at least speak to, as a more recent fan, most of the women's matches that I've watched play out very similarly to the men's matches in terms of what they're doing, the kinds of, a lot of the same moves, a lot of the same physicality. And I've seen some footage of some matches from an earlier era, and just the way that the in-ring action has changed is at least a step in the right direction in terms of equality and in terms of treating the women talent on the women talent on the roster similar to the men talent on the roster. There's that being said, I don't think that the from what I've seen, there's still problems with how women are treated versus men in the product. I think that's fair to say.
Yes.
So it's better. It's just like with the violence thing. It's gotten better. It's gotten to the point where I got interested and started watching it. One of the reasons why I was not at all touching this was back in the early 2000s. Whenever I would see it on television, I would see something like this and go, "Oh God, why would I ever be interested in something like this?"
Right. I mean, remember the few women matches that I watched back in the day, hair pulling was sort of the most traditional move, and it seems at least like we've moved away from those days.
I mean, that still is a thing. It's a real thing in UFC as well, because it is a viable grip, but there's a difference in how you do it, right? There's sort of the quote cat fighty unquote way of doing it, and there's the one where you're using it to move their head around, right?
Right.
And so just, again, changing the physical physical presentation matters a lot there. Also, honestly, the outfits are a lot less male-gazy in some cases. Not all cases. But you...
And in some of those cases, it's character work in the outfit to intentionally be that way, too.
Right. Lacey Evans is who I was thinking of when I was saying in most cases, while looking up into my brain to get my thoughts. So yeah, it's treated as a deliberate character choice rather than being the default. Because Becky Lynch comes out into the ring these days in sort of a looking like a negative version of the jumpsuit from Kill Bill that Uma Thurman wore, right? Because it's yellow on black rather than black on yellow, and looks rad. And there's nothing inherently, at least from where I'm sitting, it doesn't seem like there's anything that's inherently designed quote unquote for the male gaze, right? and again, all of this is there's still plenty of social problems with gender and with representation in wrestling, particularly women of color. Although that's getting better as well, but it's a very slow progression, right? It seems like wrestling is still a couple of steps behind our current, at least progressive side of our culture. I think that's fair to say as well. But we do have superstars like Naomi, superstars like Ember Moon, who I can think of, who are women of color who are legitimate talent on the roster. And while I might not think they're being utilized to their fullest, they're not treated like jokes as far as I can tell.
And I know we're bouncing around here a little bit, but I know that you guys had brought up, kind of related to this, you guys wanting to talk to someone about the intergender matches and sort of how that's being addressed?
So this is something that Addison and I have talked about a fair amount, and Tim and I have talked about a fair amount, and it's there's a lot of humming and hawing currently, at least among us, about intergender wrestling, because it does seem like, right, if these are violence people doing violence to each other because they're superheroes fighting other superheroes, right, that gender shouldn't play into it. But there's a strong counter argument, right, to that. I think Addison, can you speak to this a bit, because you put it into pretty good words before about like what the sponsors are willing to tolerate, but also like
you said, there's two sides to this. The kayfabe, which is the broader fiction of the universe, is that wrestling is actually a sporting event, and it would be very unusual and controversial if you had women competing against men in this kind of sport in real life. And so there's the concern about that perception of violence from men against women in the universe where you're pretending that you don't know that this is fiction. But then on the other side, because it is fiction, there is the angle where it's completely reasonable in any action movie to have, say, Vanessa Kirby and The Rock have a fist fight in Fast and the Furious.
Absolutely. In fact, those are fun scenes, right? But in part of this, like 100%, right? That's the point I was ineffectively attempting to articulate, right? That the issue seems to be, or the issue that the promotion of at least the WWE seems to be having, is that there's a way, because of the conceit of the fiction, a intergender match is going to have some quantity of a man doing violence to a woman, and within our culture right now, there's problems with that, right? And that has to do with some historical stuff and has to do with some very real problems that have been pervasive in our culture for a long time. And so because of that, they sort of stray away from that. Now, interestingly, there have been some somewhat more recent examples of intergender wrestling, but usually it's the women doing violence to the men and the men not doing much of anything to the women in turn. Sort of as putting their hands up, I can't do this type thing, which has its own kind of social problems, right? Because you can see that as we don't want to show men doing violence to women. You could also see that as that incredibly archaic idea that, women are too fragile for men to physically interact with, and so you can't do that. There's no way they'd be able to take a hit from a man, kind of thing, which is dumb and gross and stupid. But right, so you've got those two things, one of which is problematic and one of which you can at least understand the fundamental idea behind why they don't want to do it or why they're cautious about it.
there's an oft discussed reason I see floating around about the reason why promoters or companies don't want to do intergender wrestling is they feel it is too close to domestic violence, which, like, is reasonable and seems fine on the surface. And then if you dig a little more, you realize things like not all relationships are a man and a woman, and not all domestic violence is man on woman.
Mm-hmm.
And
physical at all.
Or physical at all. And it trivializes the experiences of things like men in gay relationships who experience domestic violence or other similar situations. So while it's a reasonable thought on the surface, it is just very trivial and doesn't really fully answer the problem.
And this does seem like one more area where the questions that are coming up in wrestling really mirror the questions that are coming up in a lot of the other kind of media we talk about. I mean, you just mentioned scenes where The Rock and a woman actor can get into a fight on screen and it's okay. That, at least I've never done like a formal study, but certainly from everything I've seen and read, that's a pretty recent development. 10 years ago, if there was a badass woman villain who had to be taken down, you could almost guarantee that the hero would have a badass woman sidekick, and then at the final fight, the guy would be fighting the guy villain and the woman would be fighting the woman villain. So yeah, it's just interesting to me how many of these discussions we're having are really kind of similar to the same discussions happening about these similar questions in comic books, in video games, in superhero stuff, in science fiction, etc.
Because as it turns out, it's cultural, right? And as this fiction is also a part of our culture, and it sells itself to the populace at large. And so if they don't think the populace at large is ready to accept that, they're not incented to sell it. And Tim, I just wanted to say, excellent point, and I'm really glad that you brought it up, because it's easy to sort of live within your own limited experience and not think about the fact that those sort of assertions only pass like the most rudimentary quick pass intellectual analysis. It's really important to always analyze things from outside of one's own experience to think about, well, does this pass the smell test if I remember that people aren't all like me? And so thank you very much for bringing that up. So sort of shifting from... So there's way more social concerns within wrestling that aren't related to gender or to minorities. There's obviously plenty there, in particular, like the fact that, as we talked about earlier, the use of some minorities often as foreigner characters who are almost exclusively villains because they're not American and therefore that means they're bad or whatever. Like, yeah, that still happens sometimes. But there's also other issues, such as where promotions choose to spend their money or take their money, right? And I think we wanted to talk for a little bit about some of the things that the biggest franchise of all of these, the one we've been talking the most about, the WWE, has been doing that, because it's also an ethical problem.
Yes, so this was one of the main topics of John Oliver's segment on Last Week Tonight about WWE, but it's their shows in Saudi Arabia that are paid for by the Saudi government. WWE took large amounts of money from the Saudi Arabian government to put on shows in the capital and other cities in that country and promote them and talk about them, and in some cases talk about how great and progressive Saudi Arabia is. And there's a lot to unpack there.
In particular, how many, just ballpark figure, how many women's matches do you think are at the Saudi Arabia shows?
As the person with the least amount of knowledge about this, Matthew, what do you think?
I would be amazed if there was a single one. My guess is that there is absolutely no women wrestling allowed in Saudi Arabia.
Not only that, there are not women allowed in the audience at these shows.
Not only that, but at the first Saudi Arabian show, some of the female wrestlers came up in the arena on an advertisement, and the Saudi government got very mad about it.
So here's a very clear, they're doing a bad thing and we want to call them out on it, right? There's no part of this that is acceptable. They also used the Saudi Arabia show to sort of, I guess, test pilot bringing back Hulk Hogan, a very bad human being that shouldn't be paid talent anymore, because he said some very bad things and has never even attempted to retract. So, yeah, a lot of bad to unpack in just this one thing. Particularly, I think it's offensive because of like you were saying, Tim, about how they're like running these promotions for the show, talking about how progressive this government is, right? Like,
yeah, like we could do an entire podcast on the issues with WWE's Saudi shows, from the lack of women to the several wrestlers who said, no, I'm not going there by choice, to the at least one who was banned because he's of Syrian descent.
Jesus.
I know at least one person, one host of a wrestling podcast that I listen to, has boycotted WWE since they started doing their Saudi shows. It was a line that she did not want to cross, that she felt was too far, and I don't blame her for that. I know that I've started watching less WWE and started watching more of other promotions since that's been a thing.
Because again, the only real influence we as fans have is our attention, right? Our attention and our money. And so, like, other than calling them out on things like this that are a huge problem that need to be talked about at the forefront as this is ethically unconscionable, right? The only other things we have any agency over, the only things we can do to try to make it hurt, is to take those things away, our attention and our money. And, you know, when you enjoy something like this, it's tough. Matthew, you and I have talked at length about some other properties we've enjoyed. For example, in our Harry Potter episode, where when something about the creator came about that we're not at all happy with, how that, you know, influences our enjoyment of the product itself, of the art in that case, right?
Right.
And I see this as sort of a similar problem, where there's a lot going on that I enjoy. There's a lot going on that actually is like reasonably progressive. We have Kofi Kingston is currently your champion still. Yes, he hasn't dropped the belt yet, right? Still your champion. So we have a black person who's the men's champion on one of the promotions. It's fantastic, and got that at WrestleMania, right? We've got the women's roster is at a point where they're they main evented. The women main evented WrestleMania this year. They were the very last match, right? Something that I think historically that never happened before, right? This is the first
that never
time
happened
ever,
before,
right? So there's progress being made, but you know, sometimes it's like you go 3 steps forward and some thousands of miles to the east, I guess, and so it's tough, and it is a real ethical problem when we're talking about enjoyment of these stories, that we have to consider the real life implications.
There's a saying that we have in Tim and my's friend group, which is that Ender Wiggin is a chicken sandwich, and that is referring to both the indefensible position of the author of the Ender's Game series, and also to the indefensible positions of Chick-fil-A, and how it's challenging to support the provably delicious chicken sandwich and very fascinating content of the Ender's Game novel without supporting the creators of them. And wrestling is a absolutely massive chicken sandwich.
It's so big.
Yeah, and I appreciate you phrasing it that way, because I am someone who, for example, I haven't touched Chick-fil-A in more than a year and hope to never do so again. But there's also other ways in which I do spend my money that I know other people would disagree with. I certainly stuck around as an NFL fan for a much longer time than many others. And the way you're all describing it, to be honest, I think I would have real trouble giving any of my attention to the WWE, given the kind of stuff you guys are saying. But I also think that part of the point where I was starting with is that we don't live there is no such thing as morally pure consumerism in this economy. Like, it's just not possible. And every piece of media we encounter, everything we decide to spend our money on or spend our watching time on or any of that, there's some degree of moral compromise. And it sounds like at least that each of you in your own way is sort of asking those tough questions and asking yourselves about what part of this experience will you or will you not consume, and how does that play into other things you will or won't spend your money on.
Yeah, and the struggle especially comes because of how big WWE is. They often vacuum up independent talent or talent from other promotions because WWE is quote-unquote the big leagues. So
right.
There's a line between wanting to support the people and not wanting to support the company, and it's just a very tricky balance that I struggle with a lot.
Right.
Is there such a thing as a woke wrestling promotion?
There are. You really have to look on the independent circuit for the most part there, but there are several indie promotions. I think one I heard about in the Chicago area is called Rise, that focuses on female wrestlers and queer wrestlers and put on a show for Pride called Pride and Joy that I heard gushing things about from some of my other wrestling podcasts.
Oh man,
that's pretty awesome.
I wish I could go watch that stuff. That sounds great. But generally speaking, it seems like the more the bigger, the more mainstream is probably the right word, I guess, a promotion gets. The more glacial their response is to social change and social progress. Like the one of the newer promotions, AEW, is sort of in a unique position because they're hypothetically still starting up. They're on an on-ramp. And so they've got some things going for them. They've got I don't know if this is an actual first, but I think it's is Nyla Rose like a first for a transgender wrestler, or is that just the first big name that's a transgender wrestler?
I believe she is the first trans wrestler who is getting attention on a stage as large as this.
Sure. But, I mean, it would be wild if she was, well, not completely out of the realm of intellectual possibility, right? Because we know how these things behind the scenes supposedly act as almost like a carnival, apparently, in terms of how you get your gig, right, and how you keep it. And so I would absolutely believe that there's some very backwards social ideas that would keep people, legitimate talent out of the business for backwards old reasons, right? But right. So there are some examples, but like there's this danger, right, of tokenism, of being like, oh, we've got the one, so that then we're good, right? And that's not okay either, right? You got to treat all potential talent equally and not just have, right? And I'm not saying that's the case with Nyla Rose. When you see Nyla in the ring, I 100% like, she's very impressive, and is like one of the there's nothing about the presentation of Nyla Rose that treats her any differently than any of the other women on the roster, and I love that, as far as I can tell, at least. More about her size, I think, and that just more has to do with her ability to deal damage, much in the same way that we see promotional material around Braun Strowman, who is a very large man, emphasizing the fact that he's a very large man, right? But it's still the case that, again, these are sort of exceptions and not like it hasn't reached a point where you can point to, I think, many examples of progressivism in these different promotions. And part of that is that I think a lot of their fan base doesn't agree necessarily with all of these social ideas. And they're probably paying attention to their bottom line. This is all speculation on my part. I'm not saying it's right. I fundamentally disagree with it, obviously, but there you have it. And you can also sort of see this in some of the stories they tell, right? One of the things I had on our notes here to talk about was a lot of the story beats are still coming from ideas that are part, at least in my mind, are part of toxic masculinity. You've got this story more recently. So Becky Lynch, who we mentioned earlier, and Seth Rollins are in a relationship outside of the fiction, right? And they've decided to utilize that in the narrative. And part of the way they've utilized it is they had a position where somebody did a violence to Becky, and Seth Rollins got, super angry, violent, upset, and railed on the person to, a big pop from the audience. But that sequence of events is inherently problematic because of where it's come from in our culture. Am I making sense, or am I on an island here?
It is definitely problematic in a vacuum
because they can't breathe.
And the counterpoint to that is that earlier in that same storyline, and prior to that, a violence was done to Seth, mm-hmm. and Becky was the first person to see red in that way,
right,
and defend their relationship,
right.
And I don't know if that makes it better, but it is definitely. It means that when it happened to Seth, it was even.
Right. Unfortunately, because of the gender dynamic in our culture right now, it's harder to see them, even back to back, right? It's harder to see them the same way because we don't have, it hasn't been an equal thing in our fiction, right? I don't know of many movies where you see sort of that quote, traditional gender role, unquote, that is a very loaded term, right, reversed. But so I agree that it's made, I do think it is made better because they are at least they're presenting it in sort of an equal way, that both of these people are like this, and that does a little bit to make it seem less like it's about gender, but it's still the case where when I saw the first thing, the one thing you were talking about, I was all like, yeah, Becky, go get him. And when I saw the other one, I got a little squick in my stomach where I was like, not sure I'm into that.
Well, and this lets me bring up kind of one more question, and I unfortunately have to disappear, so I'll ask one more kind of nice, small, easily digestible question that you'll just take 30 seconds on, I'm sure. One of the conversations that I hear a lot in regard to wrestling is that it is meant to be kind of almost a satire, at least today, that it's meant to be almost, a satire of toxic masculinity and of male performance-ness, particularly in that how much it goes in, that it clearly goes so far over the line from manly men doing manly things into straight up homoeroticism, and just kind of almost making fun of that idea of the jacked guy, and I'm wondering, but the flip side being that it seems to be one of those things where there's a really good irony there, but it's really easy to miss it too. And so it becomes that kind of question of what's your moral stance when you are trying really hard to make fun of something and doing it in a way that a lot of people aren't going to get the joke and are going to think you're just one more time saying, yay, men are manly men if they have bigger muscles. What's your guys' kind of take on that? to what extent the irony here is intended and whether that kind of justifies it in some way.
One of the big problems with satire as an art form is exactly that. You need the audience to be in on the joke in order for it to function as you intended.
Mm-hmm.
And so even if there is a contingent in the writer's room at the WWE that is deliberately writing things as a parody of toxic masculinity, I don't think that it is fair to say that wrestling is in any way a satire just because the vast majority of the actual week-to-week viewing audience doesn't see it that way.
Yeah, I 100% agree. If the presentation was such that a majority or even a significant contingent of the audience were viewing it in that fashion, then it playing as satire makes more sense, right? This is what people have chosen to consume it as, and so even if it wasn't intended as satire, you could argue because of the subjectivity of art that it's sort of de facto satire. But that's sort of not what's happening, at least right now, for some people. I know some people who do view it that way, and I'm not saying that their interpretation of the story is at all wrong. More that I agree with Addison that the way that the fandom generally seems to be consuming it is a lot more straight up and down as it's presented, rather than as like a veneer that is making fun of a lot of the stuff underneath. Because part of that is there are deliberate comedy spots where you are intended to be in on the joke, which makes the stuff that's played more serious not really seem like satire to me.
Right.
Again, my perspective on it.
And with that, I need to step off, but guys, this has been an awesome conversation. I've completely wrecked your outline, but please go on and continue, and I'll look forward to hearing the rest of the conversation later.
Absolutely. Take care, Matthew. We probably only, we're just going to talk about the cultural expectations thing, I think, and then go out from there. Thank you for your time. Always nice talking with you. This was sort of a last point in the outline. It's one I wanted to make sure we talked about because I think it's sort of a sideways look at this, and it's sort of playing to a point that Tim made earlier, where we're looking at things that aren't major, like not everything is made for us specifically, and sometimes that means that there are conceits that aren't a part of our culture, right? And so there are, just like we've got a bunch of different wrestling here in the States, there's also a bunch of wrestling that happens over in the UK. It's very popular in Japan. It's very popular in Mexico with Lucha Libre wrestling. So sort of springboarding off of that, I believe, Addison, you were the one who added this point to here. Is that correct?
Yeah.
So what was your what are your thoughts here? What did you want to bring forward into the discussion about the idea about the different cultural expectations and the different lines they might draw?
Yeah. So this was sort of driven by an experience that I've been having with a different over-the-top fictional property, the Yakuza game series, and it is a lot like wrestling in that it is very melodramatic, and you solve all of your problems by getting into brawls with various people. And like wrestling, it has a lot of very troubling representations of women, and especially the LGBT plus community, which is, in my experience with other Japanese media, pretty par for the course. And as a result, Japanese wrestling is not immune to that. And the subject that I wanted to sort of broach there is what kind of responsibility do you have as a viewer to contextualize things when the the mainstream that it was intended for is not the stream that you're viewing it in.
Right. So, thoughts on that, because there's I have some, right? I'm curious, Tim and Addison, as people who have consumed a lot more Japanese wrestling and lucha libre currently than I have, like, how do you feel about it?
It's because it's a different culture and comes from a different context. It's really weird to understand how I'm supposed to feel about some of these things. For instance, in Mexico and lucha libre, there are two classes or archetypes of wrestlers that we don't really see in America, and those are the minis, which are little people wrestlers, and the exoticos, which are basically drag queens wrestling, men dressing up like women and acting like women and wrestling in a very similar fashion as drag queens perform, to my understanding. Mm-hmm. And the first times I saw this, it felt incredibly offensive because of how much of a joke they were treated as. But I don't have the Mexican context of knowing where this representation comes from and whether it started out as insulting and has changed to kind of embracing these differences, or whether, like, it's still just a joke.
Right. At least the way it was presented in the one promotion I've watched in Lucha Underground, the announcer at least was talking like this was like a really cool thing, and everyone was really excited to have someone who was part of the Exotico culture in their promotion. And the fans were, cheering and applauding. And it seemed to me to be presented more as this is something they celebrated rather than this is something that they liked having around so they could laugh and mock it. But not being a part of the culture, that's harder for me to say for sure, right? Because I don't actually know.
Mm-hmm. And I think that given the rise of the internet making it considerably easier to find lucha libre and Japanese wrestling, as you mentioned, Tim and I have been watching a lot of New Japan, probably the best known Japanese promotion, because they have an online subscription service the same as the WWE does. AAA, which is one of the better known Mexican promotions, has a Twitch channel where they stream a lot of their shows, and so it's so much easier now to find these things that you need to know how to handle them,
right,
than it was even 5 years ago.
Right, and this is also why it's important to acknowledge and to understand some cultural differences that may be jarring to you, right? Given your background, but. And you're right. I think the accessibility plays a lot into why, first of all, why we can talk about it at all, right? But also why we can have these sort of different presentations, and within each of their, I hesitate to call them microcosms because Japan certainly isn't micro and neither is Mexico, but within their own subcultures to our global culture, right? Having things that having presentations and perceptions that we look at a particular way, but they might not, or it might be treated completely differently, or it might be okay in their culture, and for us it's not, or we say, well, why aren't they doing this? And it's actually going to be unconscionable for them to do it there. So. That was a whole lot of vague words to say I agree with the idea, and also to sort of, when you're watching any of this, if anybody decides to get into this, and you're seeing something coming from one of those other places, remembering that, not everybody is the United States, and that sometimes the differences are just like seem comical or strange, but Like, I think the minis are great. I love it when Masquerita Sagrada shows up on Lucha Underground. I want him to win a match, but other than that, like...
He did beat Son of Havoc, I believe.
Did he? Oh, right. When Son of Havoc was on that giant losing streak. So, okay. A little bit off topic, but yeah, the reason why I made that statement was that, like, for me, representation and the way that I sort of pH test, like strip test, whether or not a promotion is treating their talent as equal to their other talent is whether or not they let them win ever, right? So until the very finale of Lucha Underground, Cage was oddly mistreated, but
as the largest man on the roster.
Yeah, I mean he's billed as just this massive monster of a man, and yet wasn't doing a whole lot of that winning thing. Which, you know, because yes, as we discussed, it's all fictional, so the winning is sort of scripted. But it does do something story-wise to legitimacy, and that sort of plays into our ideas of the legitimacy of those people as equal to the other competitors, right? And so that's like sort of a broad meta topic as well, the idea that if you have somebody who doesn't do a lot of winning, that makes it seem to the fans like they're not as good as everybody else who is winning matches. And so there's sort of a conceit that they have to have, in order to make them legitimate, they have to actually manage those results in a way that makes it seem like everybody has a chance. I think, unless people have more to talk about on that particular topic, I think we're ready to share closing thoughts and do a wrap-up. Is there anything you wanted to talk about on that topic or on others that we didn't get to touch on?
Well, as you can see, this is a very light topic with very few points of discussion, and that's
Absolutely.
Clearly everything we can talk about on the subject.
100%. We're done. We've talked about all. Nobody ever has to do this discussion again. We've covered all of wrestling.
Until next year when there's more of it.
Right. Addison, anything else you want to talk about or want to make sure that we discussed before we wrap up?
No, I think everything that I had thought about going into this, and also lots of other things, have now already been said.
Awesome. Outstanding. Well, I want to thank both of you for coming on and joining us for this discussion. Don't think it would have been nearly as profitable if it was just me, like, mansplaining wrestling to Matthew for several hours. So it was a more organic discussion. You each had a lot to contribute that I really appreciated. If you're interested, if anybody has an interest in continuing the discussions with you after this, is there any way that you want to give out for people to contact you? So Tim, any?
Yeah, I don't use it much, but I do have a Twitter that is at AubelTim. That's at AUBELTIM on Twitter. Most of what I have on there is retweeting stuff people who are way smarter than me talk about. But if you want to start a discussion about wrestling or the ethics thereof, or if you want other media within wrestling that discusses these sort of things, I'm very happy to talk about that.
Awesome. And Addison, how can people get in touch with you if they want to?
So I am at Demullet on platforms, DAMULLET. I've got a Twitter. I've probably got a Mastodon if I can remember the password, Neopets forums, whatever. If you see somebody with that name, it's probably me.
Mm-hmm. And then, as always, as for me, I am BotsRPeople2 on Twitter. The R is the letter R, the rest are the actual words. Matthew is Caped Ethicist on Twitter, and we also have the Superhero Ethics Twitter, as well as the Superhero Ethics Facebook group. You can join that to help join in on some of the discussions we've been having. We've had a couple of people respond to our Harry Potter episode, or to what in the world did we do before Harry Potter? My brain doesn't work anymore because I'm an old person.
It was the MCU episode, I
think. Was it the MCU? Yeah, the sort of the Sunset MCU episode, right? So But really, any of the topics we've talked about, there have been many posts having discussions. It is a Facebook group, which means that one of the admins has to approve you, but we have a policy of auto-approving and then deleting spammers. So if you want to come in, you're fine. If you're a spammer, well, you are a robot, so I do acknowledge your agency as a person, but I'm still going to have to boot you from the group to keep our word count down and make sure the topics can float to the top of people's views that people actually want to talk about rather than whatever you're trying to advertise. So apologies, but that's the way it's got to be in this harsh and cruel world, my robot friends. Otherwise, I'm going to be kicking it to Matthew to do sort of a post-recording outro. But on behalf of myself, Tim, Aubel, and Addison, thank you very much for listening, and have a good day.
I heard a lip smack, but not a swallow.